My name is Robert, 68, elder for 32 years. In a sterile room, two elders urged, better to die faithful. The doctor whispered, minutes. My wife shook. My daughter brought evidence the organization never wanted me to read. Obey men, or save the life God gave me. What I chose and what followed will shock you for good. My name is Robert. I'm 68 years old, and for 32 years I served as an elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses. I knew every rule by heart, every prepared answer, every guideline that should be given to the brothers and sisters. That's why, when Dr. Martinez walked into that sterile hospital room and told me I needed an urgent blood transfusion, my response came out automatically. No, if it's Jehovah's will, I accept it. I would sign the refusal and die faithful. In that cold hospital, with the sound of monitors beeping steadily, my wife Margaret trembled in silence, while our son David paced back and forth, his face pale as paper. Two elders arrived quickly, bringing their Bibles and looks of approval. "Stay strong, brother," they said with conviction. I nodded, believing that courage meant accepting the end in silence. But deep down, there was an emptiness I didn't dare to face. The fluorescent lights above my bed hummed with that particular hospital sound that seems to penetrate your bones. Margaret's hand felt cold in mine, her wedding ring pressing against my palm the same way it had for 43 years. She whispered prayers under her breath, the same phrases we'd repeated at countless meetings, the same words that had shaped our entire adult lives. "Jehovah knows what's best," she murmured, but her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. I had been an elder since 1968, appointed when I was just 28 years old. Back then, I felt honored, chosen, special. The responsibility of shepherding God's flock weighed heavily but beautifully on my shoulders. I conducted judicial committees, gave parts at circuit assemblies, counseled struggling brothers and sisters. My briefcase was always filled with Watchtower publications, my calendar marked with service meetings, book studies, and pastoral visits. Every Thursday evening, I sat in the back room with the other elders, discussing congregation matters with the seriousness of men handling divine business. Our congregation in Millbrook was small but tight-knit. We knew everyone's struggles, everyone's victories, everyone's weaknesses. Brother Thompson struggled with alcohol. Sister Collins had doubts about the generation teaching. Young Brother Martinez kept missing meetings because of his job. We handled each case according to the organization's guidelines, always referring to the Elder's Manual, always seeking direction from the circuit overseer when needed. I believed we were doing God's work, protecting His people, maintaining spiritual purity. The chest pains had started 3 weeks earlier, right after the Tuesday night book study. I was driving home when it felt like someone was squeezing my heart with a giant fist. Margaret wanted to call an ambulance, but I insisted it was just stress from the recent circuit overseer's visit. "Jehovah's servants don't get sick when they're doing His will," I had said, repeating what I'd heard countless times from the platform. How wrong I was. Dr. Martinez was a kind man, probably in his 50s, with gentle eyes that had seen too much suffering. He explained my condition with patience, drawing diagrams and using words I could understand. My blood count was dangerously low, my body was failing, and without immediate intervention, I would likely die within hours. The solution was simple from a medical standpoint: blood transfusion, followed by surgery, then recovery. But for a Jehovah's Witness, it was a death sentence either way. "There are alternatives," Dr. Martinez had said carefully, studying my face. "But I have to be honest with you, Mr. Henderson. The chances of success without blood are extremely slim. We're talking about maybe 10% survival rate, and that's being optimistic." I thanked him for his honesty and asked for some time to pray about it. He nodded respectfully and left us alone with our Bibles and our fears. The elders who came to visit were Brother Williams and Brother Foster, both good men I'd served alongside for years. They brought the familiar comfort of shared beliefs and unwavering certainty. "Brother Henderson," said Brother Williams, placing his weathered hand on my shoulder. "This is your opportunity to show faithful endurance like Job. Think of the witness you'll give to the medical staff." Brother Foster opened his Bible to Acts 15:29 and read aloud, "Keep abstaining from things sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from sexual immorality." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. But as they spoke about faithful endurance and the resurrection hope, I found myself staring at the IV tube in my arm, thinking about the blood flowing through my veins. Blood that Jehovah himself had created. Blood that sustained the life he had given me. Was it really his will that I refuse the very substance he had designed to keep me alive? The question came from somewhere deep inside, from a place I'd learned to silence over the years of faithful service. Margaret squeezed my hand tighter as the elders prepared to leave. "We'll be praying for you, brother," they said. "Remember, better to die faithful than to live in sin." Their words echoed in the empty room long after they'd gone, mixing with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of life continuing in the hallway outside. As night fell over the hospital, I lay awake, listening to my heart beat against the silence. Each beat reminded me that time was running out, that soon I would have to choose between the life I'd been given and the organization I'd served for most of it. In that darkness, with Margaret sleeping fitfully in the chair beside me, I began to wonder if there might be a difference between faithfulness to God and faithfulness to men. The red numbers on the digital clock beside my bed changed slowly. 11:47, 11:48, 11:49. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour like a lifetime of questions I'd never allowed myself to ask. The morning brought new doctors, new tests, and the same impossible choice. My blood pressure had dropped even further during the night, and Dr. Martinez's concerned expression told me more than his carefully chosen words. "Mr. Henderson, we really need to move quickly," he said, checking my chart for the third time in an hour. Margaret had been awake since 5, reading her Bible and underlining verses about faithful endurance, her lips moving silently in prayer. I had become a Jehovah's Witness in 1965 when I was 25 years old. My parents were Methodist, good people who raised me to believe in God, but never with the intensity I found in the Kingdom Hall. I remember the first meeting I attended, invited by a co-worker named Jim, who'd been studying with the witnesses for 6 months. The certainty in that room was intoxicating. Here were people who had answers to every question, who knew exactly what God wanted, who could explain every Bible verse with precision and confidence. Jim introduced me to Brother Patterson, the presiding overseer, a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight into your soul. "Young man," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "you've found the truth at just the right time. Armageddon is coming soon, probably before 1975, and Jehovah is gathering his people now." Those words sent electricity through my veins. I was being invited into something exclusive, something urgent, something that would give my life meaning beyond anything I'd ever imagined. Margaret came into the truth 2 years later. She was a nurse at the local hospital, a beautiful woman with auburn hair and a gentle spirit who caught my eye during our door-to-door work in her neighborhood. "I've been looking for real answers about God," she told me during our first Bible study together. "My church just gives me traditions, but you people actually use the Bible." We married in 1968, the same year I was appointed as a ministerial servant. And by 1970, we were both pioneering together, spending 70 hours a month preaching door to door. Our children, David and Sarah, were born into the truth. David arrived in 1971, a serious boy who rarely smiled but always obeyed. Sarah came 3 years later, full of questions and energy that sometimes worried the elders. We raised them according to Watchtower guidelines. No birthdays, no Christmas, no close friendships with worldly children, no higher education beyond high school. "The world is ending soon," I would tell them when they complained about being different. "These sacrifices are temporary. But Jehovah's approval is eternal. David grew up to be everything the organization wanted in a young man. He was baptized at 14, started pioneering at 18, and was appointed as a ministerial servant by 21. He married Ruth, a pioneer sister from another congregation, and they moved to where the need was greater, serving in a rural territory 200 miles away. They visited twice a year, always during circuit assemblies or district conventions, always talking about their service time and how Jehovah was blessing their work. Sarah was different. Even as a child, she asked questions that made me uncomfortable. "Daddy, why can't I go to Jennifer's birthday party? Jesus ate at celebrations." Or, "Why do we say the world is ending soon when it's been soon for my whole life?" I would give her the standard answers from the publications, but her questions stayed with me during the quiet moments. When she turned 18, instead of pioneering like her brother, she got a job at a local bookstore and started taking night classes at the community college. The elders counseled me about her spiritual goals, suggesting that perhaps I hadn't been firm enough in my headship. Brother Williams, who was now sitting beside my hospital bed, had been like a father to me in the truth. He was already an elder when I was first appointed, a man who'd survived the disappointment of 1975 when Armageddon didn't come as expected. "The light gets brighter," he always said, when younger brothers expressed doubts about the organization's changing teachings. "Jehovah reveals his purposes gradually," says. He had shepherded me through my early years as an elder, teaching me how to conduct judicial committees, how to handle disassociation cases, how to maintain the congregation's spiritual cleanliness. "Robert," he said now, his voice gentle but firm, "I know this is difficult, but think about all the brothers and sisters who are watching. Think about the example you're setting. Remember Sister Johnson." I did remember her. Sister Johnson was an elderly widow who had refused blood during a routine surgery in 1987. She died on the operating table, and we held her up as a martyr, a faithful servant who chose obedience over life. At her funeral, I had given the talk, praising her faithfulness and encouraging others to follow her example. Brother Foster, younger than Brother Williams but equally convinced, opened his copy of the Reasoning from the Scriptures book. "Brother Henderson, look what it says here about the sanctity of life. Life is sacred to Jehovah, but not more sacred than obedience to his commands. The blood prohibition comes directly from the apostles in Acts chapter 15. This isn't a human commandment, it's from God himself." He read several paragraphs about faithful Christians throughout history who had died rather than compromise their beliefs. Margaret nodded along with everything they said, but I noticed she kept glancing at the monitors, showing my vital signs. The numbers kept getting worse, blood pressure dropping, heart rate irregular, oxygen levels concerning. "Honey," she whispered, when the elders stepped out to talk with Dr. Martinez, "are you sure about this? Maybe Jehovah wants you to live. Maybe he's providing medical help through the doctors." Her words surprised me. In 43 years of marriage, Margaret had never questioned the organization's teachings. She was the perfect elder's wife, submissive, faithful, always supporting the decisions of the body of elders. She had pioneered for 30 years, conducted dozens of Bible studies, raised our children in the truth without complaint. To hear doubt in her voice was like hearing her speak in a foreign language. "Margaret," I said weakly, "you know what the organization teaches. Blood is sacred to Jehovah. We can't compromise just because the situation is difficult." But even as I said the words, they felt hollow, rehearsed, like lines from a play I'd been performing for too long. Deep inside, a voice I'd been silencing for years was getting louder. "But what if they're wrong? What if God wants you to live?" The afternoon brought more visitors. Sister Coleman came with a flower arrangement and a Watchtower article about faithful endurance. Brother and Sister Martinez brought their teenage daughter, who looked uncomfortable in her meeting dress, shifting from foot to foot while her parents spoke about the resurrection hope. Brother Henderson has always been such a good example, Sister Martinez told her daughter. "See how he's putting Jehovah first, even in this trial?" But I was watching the girl's face, seeing my own daughter Sarah at that age, full of questions she wasn't allowed to ask. This teenager was looking at me with something that wasn't admiration. It was confusion, maybe even horror. She was watching an old man choose death over medical treatment, and she couldn't understand why everyone was calling it faithful. Young Brother Stevens, newly appointed as a ministerial servant, brought his Bible and his enthusiasm. Brother Henderson, this reminds me of the 3 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace. They were willing to die rather than compromise, and Jehovah honored their faithfulness. He read the entire account from Daniel, his voice rising with excitement as he reached the climax, where God saves them from the flames. But God saved them, I found myself saying. He didn't let them die. He provided a way out. The words surprised me as much as they surprised Brother Stevens. I'd never questioned a comparison from the platform before, never pointed out inconsistencies in the organization's reasoning. Brother Stevens looked confused, glancing at Brother Williams for guidance. "Well, yes," Brother Williams said carefully, "but sometimes Jehovah's deliverance comes through the resurrection. Not everyone is delivered in this life. Remember Stephen. He was faithful unto death, and his reward was in heaven." The explanation felt rehearsed, automatic, the kind of answer I'd given hundreds of times from the platform when faced with difficult questions. As evening approached, Dr. Martinez returned with test results that made everyone in the room fall silent. "Mr. Henderson, I'm going to be very direct with you. You have maybe 12 hours, possibly less. Your body is shutting down. I can try some alternative treatments, but honestly, they're not going to work. The only real option is immediate blood transfusion, followed by emergency surgery." The room felt smaller suddenly, filled with the weight of an impossible decision. Margaret was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The elders stood like sentinels, guardians of doctrinal purity, ready to support whatever decision maintained organizational loyalty. But in that moment, looking at my wife's tears and thinking about my children, I began to wonder if faithfulness to God might look different than faithfulness to men. The night stretched endlessly before me, filled with the soft beeping of machines and the weight of impossible choices. Margaret had fallen asleep in the chair beside my bed, her Bible still open in her lap to Psalms, her reading glasses slightly askew on her nose. The hallway outside remained busy with the quiet efficiency of night shift nurses, their soft-soled shoes making whispered sounds against the polished floors. I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing despite my body's weakness, replaying decades of certainty that now felt as fragile as spiderwebs. Dr. Martinez had left specific instructions with the nursing staff. "Call me immediately if there's any change in his condition or if he reconsiders the treatment," he'd told the head nurse, loud enough for me to hear. "We're running out of time." The urgency in his voice had shaken something loose inside me, some carefully constructed wall between duty and survival that had protected me for 37 years of faithful service. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself thinking about Brother Thompson, our circuit overseer from the early 80s. He was a man in his 50s then, distinguished and authoritative, who visited our congregation twice a year to provide spiritual encouragement and organizational updates. During one of his visits, he pulled me aside after the Thursday night meeting for elders. "Brother Henderson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, "the faithful and discreet slave has provided new understanding about blood fractions. Some components are now matters of conscience." I remember feeling confused, but "Brother," I had asked, "if blood is sacred to Jehovah, how can parts of it be acceptable while the whole is forbidden?" Brother Thompson's expression had hardened slightly. "Robert," he said, using my first name in a way that felt like a gentle rebuke, "we don't question the slave class. When they provide new light, we accept it gratefully and adjust our understanding. That's what it means to be humble before Jehovah's organization." That conversation came back to me now with startling clarity. Blood fractions, albumin, immunoglobulins, clotting factors were suddenly acceptable. The very substance that had been forbidden for decades was now passed into acceptable and unacceptable components based on molecular size and processing methods. If a cow's blood was sacred and couldn't be transfused, how could proteins extracted from that same blood become a matter of personal conscience? The logical inconsistency had bothered me then, but I had pushed the questions down, buried them under layers of organizational loyalty and spiritual submission. Margaret stirred in her sleep, murmuring something I couldn't understand. Her face looked peaceful in the dim light from the monitors, untroubled by the doubts that were tearing me apart. She had always been stronger in the faith than me, more willing to accept difficult teachings without question, more committed to the organization's authority. When the 1995 Watchtower changed the understanding of this generation, explaining that Jesus hadn't meant the generation that saw 1914 would see Armageddon, Margaret had simply nodded and said, "The light gets brighter." I had struggled with it privately, remembering all the talks I'd given, all the studies I'd conducted, all the promises I'd made about the end coming before those people died. The memory led to others, a cascade of moments when my certainty had wavered. There was Sister Patricia, a young mother who had come to me for counsel in 1992. Her husband was beating her, leaving bruises on her arms and threatening worse if she ever told anyone. "Brother Henderson," she had whispered during our meeting in the Kingdom Hall Library, "I don't know what to do. He says, if I report him to the police, he'll have me disfellowshipped for bringing reproach on Jehovah's name." I had opened the Elder's Manual, looking for guidance on domestic violence cases. The instructions were clear: encourage the sister to be more submissive, to pray more fervently, to trust that Jehovah would change her husband's heart through her faithful example. "Sister Patricia," I had said, following the organizational guidelines exactly, "marriage is a sacred arrangement. Jehovah hates divorce. Perhaps if you examine your own conduct and make sure you're being the kind of wife described in Proverbs 31, your husband's behavior will improve." 6 months later, Sister Patricia was in the hospital with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs. Her husband told everyone she had fallen down the stairs. The elders accepted his explanation and counseled the congregation about not listening to gossip. Patricia never came back to the meetings after she was released from the hospital. I heard later that she had moved across the country with her children, changing her name and starting over. At the time, I had felt satisfied that we had maintained the congregation's spiritual cleanliness by not entertaining her accusations against a baptized brother. Now lying in my own hospital bed, I wondered if we had protected an abuser and abandoned a victim. The pattern became clearer as I lay there in the darkness, my strength ebbing with each labored breath. There was Brother Kevin, a teenager who had come to me in tears, confessing that his father had been molesting him for years. I had followed organizational policy. Unless there were 2 witnesses to the abuse, no action could be taken against the father. Kevin was counseled not to bring reproach on Jehovah's name by involving outside authorities. His father remained an elder for 3 more years until Kevin finally turned 18 and went to the police himself. The resulting investigation revealed 4 other victims in the congregation. We had protected the organization's reputation while allowing children to suffer. There was Sister Helen, an elderly widow who had questioned the accuracy of the 1914 doctrine after reading secular history that contradicted the organization's chronology. Instead of addressing her concerns, we had labeled her as having an independent spirit and encouraged the congregation to limit association with her until she demonstrated proper submission to the faithful and discreet slave. She died alone 2 years later, cut off from the only community she had known for 40 years. Case after case flooded my memory. Faithful people who had asked honest questions or faced genuine crises, only to be silenced, shunned, or sacrificed on the altar of organizational loyalty. I had participated in every decision, had enforced every policy, had believed I was protecting God's people while actually serving human authority that demanded blind obedience. Around 5 in the morning, Sarah arrived. I hadn't seen her in 3 months, not since the elders had counseled me about her spiritual goals and suggested I limit contact to encourage her return to regular meeting attendance. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the modest dresses required for witnesses. "Dad," she said quietly, settling into the chair on the other side of my bed. "David called me. He said you're refusing treatment." Margaret woke up at the sound of Sarah's voice, immediately tense. Our daughter had been marked as bad association for the past 2 years, ever since she'd started asking questions about the organization's policies on higher education and blood transfusions. "Sarah," Margaret said carefully, "this isn't the time for your doubts. Your father needs support in his decision to remain faithful." But Sarah wasn't looking at Margaret. She was studying my face with the intensity she'd shown as a child when working through difficult math problems. "Dad," she said, "do you remember when I was 8 and fell off my bike? You didn't pray about whether to take me to the emergency room. You just scooped me up and drove as fast as you could to get me help. You said later that God gave parents instincts to protect their children." The memory was vivid. Sarah bleeding from a deep cut on her forehead, me panicking as I carried her to the car, Margaret holding pressure on the wound while I ran 3 red lights getting to the hospital. 12 stitches and a tetanus shot later, Sarah was fine, proudly showing off her bandage to anyone who would look. I had never once considered that accepting medical treatment might displease God. It had seemed natural, obvious, the loving thing to do. "That was different," Margaret said quickly. "That wasn't about blood. That was just emergency care." But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. I could see her remembering that night too, remembering how we had trusted medical professionals without question when our child was hurt. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Dad, I've been researching the blood doctrine. Did you know that the organization allows blood fractions that make up 97% of blood's volume, but forbids the tiny percentage that includes red cells, white cells, platelets, and plasma? If someone can accept hemoglobin, which is the main component of red blood cells, how is accepting the whole red blood cell different?" Margaret stood up abruptly. "Sarah, this is not the time for your apostate research. Your father is making a faithful decision based on Bible principles, not human wisdom." Her voice carried the rehearsed authority of someone repeating organizational talking points, but I heard something else underneath. Fear, uncertainty, the tremor of someone whose certainty was being challenged. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm trying to save Dad's life. Look at him, really look at him. He's dying. And for what? For a policy that doesn't even make scientific or biblical sense." She unfolded the paper and began reading medical explanations of blood components, biblical scholars' interpretations of the Acts 15 prohibition, historical evidence about early Christian practices. I listened to my daughter's research with growing amazement. She had spent months studying the issue from medical, historical, and theological perspectives. She quoted doctors, Bible scholars, even former Bethel workers who had questioned the doctrine privately. Her arguments were logical, well-researched, and devastating to the organizational position I had defended for decades. But more than her facts, it was her tears that moved me. "Dad," she whispered, "I can't lose you. Not to death, and not to an organization that would rather see you die than admit their policy might be wrong. Please, just consider that maybe God wants you to live. Maybe he's providing help through these doctors, and refusing it isn't faithfulness, it's pride." Margaret was crying now too, torn between decades of conditioning and the reality of losing her husband. "Robert," she said, her voice breaking, "what if she's right? What if we've been wrong all these years? What if God doesn't want you to die for this?" The sun was beginning to rise outside my window, painting the sky in soft pastels that reminded me of the mornings when I would prepare my elder talks, confident in my authority to guide God's people. But that confidence felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had belonged to a different person who had never questioned, never doubted, never imagined that faithfulness might require thinking rather than just obeying. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, his face grave as he checked his watch. "Mr. Henderson," he said quietly, "I need to know your decision. Your condition has deteriorated significantly during the night. If we're going to act, it has to be now." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of my heart monitor, each sound marking another second of a decision that couldn't be delayed any longer. Dr. Martinez stood in the doorway, his clipboard in hand, waiting for an answer that would determine whether I lived or died. Margaret gripped my left hand while Sarah held my right, two women who represented different paths forward, one rooted in organizational loyalty, the other in questions I had spent 37 years refusing to ask. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked, though we all knew the answer. My voice came out as barely more than a whisper, my strength fading with each labored breath. "Minutes, not hours," Dr. Martinez replied with gentle honesty. "Your blood pressure is dropping dangerously low. Your organs are beginning to shut down. Without immediate intervention, you'll likely lose consciousness soon, and then the opportunity for treatment will pass." Margaret squeezed my hand tighter. "Robert, whatever you decide, I'll support you, but I need you to know, if you die, you'll be leaving me alone. 43 years of marriage, and I don't know how to live without you." Her voice cracked on the last words, raw with emotion I had rarely heard from her in our decades together. Sarah leaned closer, her tears falling on my arm. "Dad, remember what you taught me when I was little. You said God gave us brains to think and hearts to feel. You said blind obedience without understanding wasn't faith, it was fear. Maybe it's time to trust the mind and heart God gave you instead of men who claim to speak for him." The weight of her words settled over me like a blanket. How many times had I counseled brothers and sisters to think for themselves when facing personal decisions, only to demand blind obedience when it came to organizational policies? How many times had I preached about God's love and mercy while enforcing rules that showed neither? "Brother Henderson," came a familiar voice from the hallway. Brother Williams appeared in the doorway, having returned for what he probably sensed would be the final conversation. "I heard the doctor speaking with the nurses. This is your moment of ultimate test, brother. This is when you prove whether your faith is real or just words." He walked to my bedside with the authority of a man who had never doubted, never questioned, never allowed human emotion to interfere with organizational loyalty. Think about Job, Robert. He lost everything, his children, his wealth, his health, but he never cursed God. He remained faithful even when his wife told him to curse God and die. This is your Job moment. But Job questioned God, I found myself saying, surprising everyone in the room, including myself. He demanded answers. He argued with his friends, who gave him easy religious explanations. And in the end, God didn't condemn him for his questions. He condemned the friends who spoke without understanding. Brother Williams looked taken aback. In 37 years of serving together, I had never contradicted his spiritual analogies. "Robert, you're not thinking clearly. The medication is affecting your judgment. You need to trust the organization's guidance, not your own understanding." "Whose understanding?" The question came out louder than I intended, with more force than my weakened body should have been able to produce. "The understanding of men in Brooklyn who've never sat in this hospital bed, men who've changed their explanation of blood doctrine 6 times in my lifetime, men who'll go home to their families tonight while mine mourns at my funeral." The room went completely quiet. Margaret stared at me with wide eyes. She had never heard me speak against the organization with such directness. Sarah looked hopeful but frightened, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Brother Williams appeared stunned, struggling to process words that bordered on apostasy from a man he had trusted as spiritually mature. "Robert," he said carefully, "you're speaking like someone who's lost faith. This is exactly what Satan wants, to use your physical weakness to create spiritual weakness. Don't throw away 37 years of faithful service in a moment of human frailty." But something had broken loose inside me, some dam that had held back decades of suppressed questions and uncomfortable truths. 37 years of faithful service to what? I asked. To God, or to an organization that claims to speak for Him? Because right now, lying here dying, I can't tell the difference anymore. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat gently. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we really can't wait any longer. Mr. Henderson, I need your decision now. Yes or no to the blood transfusion?" I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but instead of the rehearsed phrases I had repeated for decades, something else came to mind. It was a memory from 1973, just after the organization had published new information about 1975 and the end of the world. I'd been studying with a young man named Michael who asked a simple question. If the end was supposed to come in 1975, and now they're saying maybe it won't, how do I know what to believe? I had given him the standard answer about progressive revelation and increasing light, but privately, his question had haunted me. How do you maintain faith in an organization that admits to being wrong about life and death matters, while claiming divine guidance? I had pushed the question down, buried it under busy service schedules and elder responsibilities, but it had never really gone away. Now, 30 years later, facing my own life and death decision, Michael's question echoed with new urgency. If the organization could be wrong about the end of the world, wrong about the generation that would see it, wrong about organ transplants, forbidden then allowed, wrong about alternative service, forbidden then allowed, how could I trust them to be right about blood? Margaret was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking. "Robert, please, I can't lose you. Not like this. Not when there's help available." Her voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before, the sound of a woman watching her husband choose death over life for reasons she was beginning to question. Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger now. "Dad, you taught me that God is love. You said that every good gift comes from Him. What if medical knowledge is one of those gifts? What if He's providing a way to save your life, and refusing it isn't faithfulness, it's stubbornness?" Brother Williams stepped forward, his voice taking on the tone he used from the platform during serious talks. "Sister Sarah, you're not baptized. You don't understand the depth of commitment required for true faithfulness. Your father knows that compromise in this area means eternal destruction. He's choosing everlasting life over temporary physical existence." "No," I said, the word coming out with surprising strength. "No, Brother Williams. I'm choosing life over death. I'm choosing to trust the God who gave me a brain to think and a heart to love over men who demand blind obedience. I'm choosing to believe that the Creator who designed blood to sustain life doesn't want me to refuse it when my life depends on it." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence. Brother Williams stepped back as if I had struck him, his face registering shock, disappointment, and something that might have been fear. Fear that others might follow my example, might start thinking for themselves, might choose life over organizational loyalty. "Dr. Martinez," I said, looking directly at the physician who had waited patiently through our theological debate, "I accept the blood transfusion. Please do whatever you need to do to save my life." Margaret sobbed with relief, squeezing my hand so tightly it almost hurt. Sarah leaned down and kissed my forehead, whispering, "Thank you, Daddy," through her tears. Brother Williams stood frozen, staring at me as if I had just committed the unforgivable sin. "I'll prepare the OR immediately," Dr. Martinez said, already moving toward the door. "We'll take good care of you, Mr. Henderson. You've made the right choice." As the medical team began preparing for my surgery, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: peace. Not the artificial peace of organizational approval, but the deep peace of a man who had finally chosen life over death, love over fear, thinking over blind obedience. For the first time in 37 years, I felt truly free. The hours following my decision passed in a blur of medical activity and emotional upheaval. The blood transfusion began immediately, and I could feel strength returning to my body almost instantly. Dr. Martinez explained each step of the process with reassuring professionalism, while nurses monitored my vital signs with the efficiency of people who saved lives every day. For the first time in weeks, the numbers on my monitors began moving in the right direction, blood pressure stabilizing, heart rate becoming regular, oxygen levels improving. Margaret never left my side during the transfusion, holding my hand and watching the bag of blood slowly empty into my veins. I could see the conflict in her eyes, relief that I was improving, but also fear about what this decision meant for our life together. "Robert," she whispered during a quiet moment between nurse visits, "what happens now? What do we tell people? What do we tell the elders?" Brother Williams had left immediately after my decision, his face a mask of disappointment and what looked like personal betrayal. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't offered a prayer for my recovery, hadn't even acknowledged that I was still alive to be reasoned with. His silence spoke louder than any words could have. In the organization's eyes, I had already chosen death, spiritual death, by accepting life-saving medical treatment. Sarah sat in the corner of the room, making phone calls to update family members and arrange time off from work to help with my recovery. I listened to her explaining the situation to relatives, carefully avoiding the religious implications while focusing on the medical facts. "Dad had a blood disorder," she would say. "He's receiving treatment and should be fine." She was protecting me, I realized, from conversations that would force me to defend my decision before I was ready. The surgery went smoothly. Dr. Martinez removed the diseased tissue that had been causing my blood loss and repaired the damage that months of declining health had created. When I woke up in the recovery room 6 hours later, Margaret's face was the first thing I saw. She looked exhausted, but relieved, older than when I had gone under, but somehow more peaceful. "How do you feel?" she asked, adjusting my blanket with the careful attention she had always shown during my minor illnesses over the years. "Alive," I answered, and the simple truth of that word hit me with unexpected force. I was alive. Not because I had demonstrated faith through suffering, not because I had endured to the end, but because I had chosen medical treatment over religious prohibition. The God I had served for 37 years had not struck me down for accepting blood. The sky had not fallen, the earth had not opened up to swallow me, but the consequences of my choice began almost immediately. David called that evening, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Dad, Brother Williams contacted me. He said you accepted blood. Please tell me there's been a misunderstanding." When I confirmed the truth, the silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. "Dad, you know what this means. You've compromised your standing before Jehovah. You've brought reproach on the organization. How can I explain this to Ruth, to the brothers in our congregation?" "David," I said carefully, "I'm your father. I'm alive. Isn't that more important than organizational policies?" But even as I asked the question, I knew his answer. David had been raised to value organizational loyalty above family relationships, spiritual reputation above human connection. To him, I had chosen temporal life over eternal life, and no amount of explanation would change that calculation. The elders came the next morning, not to celebrate my recovery, but to begin what they called a shepherding visit. Brother Williams, Brother Foster, and Brother Patterson, the current presiding overseer, arranged their chairs around my bed like judges preparing for a trial. They brought their Bibles, their organizational manuals, and expressions of grave concern. "Brother Henderson," said Brother Patterson, a man 20 years younger than me, who had been appointed to his position based on organizational loyalty rather than life experience. We need to discuss the serious step you've taken. Accepting blood transfusion is a matter that affects your standing in the congregation. Margaret sat beside my bed, her Bible open but her hands shaking slightly. She had spent the night reading scripture, searching for answers to questions she had never allowed herself to ask. "Brothers," she said hesitantly, "the Bible passages about blood seem to be talking about eating blood in ritual contexts. Is medical transfusion really the same thing?" Brother Foster opened his copy of Reasoning from the Scriptures and began reading the organization's explanation of why blood transfusion violated biblical principles. As he quoted familiar paragraphs, I realized how circular the reasoning was. The organization forbade blood transfusion because the organization said blood transfusion was forbidden. There was no independent biblical analysis, no consideration of medical realities, no acknowledgement that the apostolic prohibition might have been addressing specific cultural practices rather than establishing eternal medical restrictions. "Brothers," I interrupted, surprising them with my directness, "I've been thinking about this for 3 days. If God designed blood to sustain life, and He gave human beings the knowledge to transfer blood safely from one person to another, how is using that knowledge different from using any other medical treatment? When Jesus healed people, He didn't lecture them about accepting help. He provided it." Indeed, the 3 elders exchanged glances, the kind of look that passed between men who were accustomed to dealing with spiritual rebellion. "Brother Henderson," said Brother Williams, "you're thinking like a man, not like someone who submits to God's organization. The faithful and discreet slave has explained clearly why blood transfusion violates God's law. Your job isn't to understand it, your job is to obey it." "But what if they're wrong?" The question came out before I could stop it, and the silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked at me with wide eyes. Sarah stopped pretending to read her magazine, and the 3 elders stared as if I had just blasphemed in the Kingdom Hall. Brother Patterson leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone used for judicial committee meetings. "Brother Henderson, are you questioning the authority of God's organization? Because that's a very serious spiritual position. The faithful and discreet slave is God's channel of communication. To question them is to question God Himself." "No," I said, feeling clearer than I had in decades. "I'm questioning the authority of men who claim to speak for God, but whose teachings keep changing. I'm questioning an organization that would rather see me dead than admit their interpretation might be wrong. I'm questioning whether faithfulness to God requires blind obedience to human authority." Margaret reached for my hand, and I could feel her trembling. She was hearing her husband of 43 years express doubts that she had never allowed herself to voice, challenging beliefs that had shaped our entire adult life together. "Robert," she whispered, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying that lying in that bed facing death, I had to choose between trusting God and trusting men. I chose to trust that the God who created life wants me to preserve it. I chose to trust that the God who gave human beings medical knowledge intended for it to be used. I chose to trust my conscience over organizational policy." Brother Williams stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and disappointment. "Robert, you're speaking like an apostate. You're letting human reasoning override divine guidance. This attitude will destroy your spiritual standing and bring reproach on your family's reputation in the congregation." "Then so be it," I said, and the words felt like breaking chains. "If choosing life over death makes me an apostate, if thinking for myself instead of letting others think for me brings reproach, if trusting God directly instead of through human intermediaries destroys my spiritual standing, then maybe it's time to find out what real spirituality looks like." The 3 elders left without offering a prayer for my recovery, without expressing gratitude that I had survived, without showing any of the love and concern that should characterize Christian shepherds. Their departure felt like a door closing on 37 years of my life, but also like a window opening onto possibilities I had never imagined. That afternoon, As I sat by the window watching ordinary people go about their ordinary lives, I began to understand something that had eluded me for decades. Faith wasn't supposed to be fear wrapped in religious language. Love wasn't supposed to be conditional on organizational approval. Truth wasn't supposed to require silencing honest questions. For the first time since 1965, I felt like I might be on the path to discovering what it really meant to have a relationship with God. 2 years have passed since that morning when I chose life over organizational loyalty, and I'm sitting in my garden watching Margaret tend to her roses while Sarah visits with her 2 children, grandchildren I almost never got to meet. The afternoon sun feels warm on my face, and I can hear the distant laughter of neighborhood kids playing in the park across the street. These are simple pleasures, ordinary moments that I might have missed if I had followed the organization's guidance to its logical conclusion. The path away from the Jehovah's Witnesses wasn't easy. Within 3 weeks of my decision to accept blood transfusion, we received official notification that I was no longer qualified to serve as an elder. The letter was formal, clinical, devoid of any acknowledgement of my 37 years of faithful service or gratitude for my recovery. It simply stated that I had compromised Bible principles and could no longer represent the organization in any leadership capacity. Margaret and I tried to continue attending meetings for several months, hoping that time would heal the rift and that our decision could be understood as a moment of human weakness rather than spiritual rebellion. But the atmosphere in the Kingdom Hall had changed completely. Brothers and sisters who had been close friends for decades suddenly found reasons to avoid conversation with us. Families we had shared meals with stopped inviting us to social gatherings. The warm hugs and genuine smiles that had characterized our congregation relationships were replaced by polite nods and awkward distances. David stopped calling entirely after the elders in his congregation counseled him about maintaining spiritual boundaries with family members who had compromised their faith. Ruth sent a carefully worded letter explaining that while they loved us, they needed to protect their own spiritual standing by limiting association with us. The letter felt like it had been written with organizational guidelines rather than human emotion. Technically correct, theologically sound, and heartbreaking in its controlled distance. The breaking point came during a circuit assembly in September 2002. Margaret and I attended as we had for decades, hoping to find some sense of belonging in the larger community of believers. But during the lunch break, we overheard a conversation between 2 elders' wives discussing our situation. "It's such a shame about the Hendersons," one said to the other. 37 years of service, and then they throw it all away for a few more years of life in this system. It just shows you can't trust anyone these days. Margaret started crying right there in the assembly hall, and I realized we were mourning not just the loss of our religious community, but the death of relationships we had thought were built on genuine love. We left that assembly early and never returned to another Kingdom Hall meeting. Sarah was our lifeline during those difficult months. She helped us find a small, non-denominational church where questions were welcomed rather than feared, where doubt was seen as part of faith rather than evidence of spiritual weakness. Pastor Johnson was a gentleman in his 60s who had spent years studying with former Jehovah's Witnesses, helping them transition from organizational control to personal relationship with God. "Robert," he told me during our first meeting, "God doesn't need human intermediaries to love you. He doesn't require organizational approval to accept you. Your worth isn't determined by how well you follow man-made rules." Learning to pray without organizational language was one of the most challenging adjustments. For decades, my prayers had been filled with watchtower phrases and concepts, asking for spiritual food at the proper time, praying for the faithful and discreet slave, requesting help to remain in the truth, discovering how to speak to God directly without filtering my thoughts through organizational doctrine felt like learning a new language. But gradually, I began to experience something I had never known during my years as an elder: genuine peace in prayer, real communication with the divine rather than recitation of approved phrases. Margaret struggled more than I did with the transition. She had been a Jehovah's Witness longer than me, had pioneered for 30 years, had built her entire identity around organizational service. "Robert," she said one evening as we sat reading our Bibles, without Watchtower literature to guide our understanding, "I don't know who I am anymore. For 40 years, the organization told me what to think, what to believe, how to act. Now I have to figure out what I actually believe, and it's terrifying." But slowly, gradually, we both began to discover the difference between religion and spirituality, between organizational loyalty and genuine faith. We started attending Bible study groups, where participants were encouraged to share different perspectives, where honest questions were celebrated rather than condemned. We read books by theologians and historians that helped us understand how the Bible was assembled, how Christian doctrine developed over centuries, how many interpretations were possible for passages that the Watchtower presented as having only one correct understanding. The most healing discovery was learning about other former Jehovah's Witnesses who had made similar journeys. Through support groups and online forums, we connected with hundreds of people who had left the organization for reasons ranging from doctrinal disagreements to discovering organizational dishonesty about child abuse policies. Hearing their stories helped us realize that our doubts and questions weren't signs of spiritual weakness. They were evidence of intellectual honesty and moral courage. Today, Margaret and I attend a small Episcopal church where the pastor encourages questions and the community embraces doubt as part of spiritual growth. We volunteer at a local homeless shelter, help with community food drives, and participate in interfaith dialogue sessions. The work feels meaningful in ways that door-to-door preaching never did, focused on helping people with immediate needs rather than converting them to organizational membership. Our relationship with David remains strained, but Sarah has flourished in ways that surprise even me. Free from organizational restrictions on higher education, she completed her master's degree in social work and now counsels families affected by religious trauma. "Dad," she told me recently, "watching you choose life over blind obedience taught me that real faith requires courage to think for yourself. I still believe in God, perhaps more deeply than ever before. But now my faith is personal rather than organizational, based on relationship rather than rules, characterized by love rather than fear. I don't have all the answers anymore, and I've learned to be comfortable with mystery, with questions that don't have simple solutions, with the humility of admitting when I don't understand something, the blood that flows through my veins. Some of it donated by strangers who will never know they helped save my life, reminds me daily that God works through human compassion and medical knowledge, not just through religious organizations. Every morning when I wake up beside Margaret, every afternoon when Sarah calls to check on us, every evening when we sit together reading without feeling guilty about our questions, I'm grateful for the choice I made in that hospital room. If I had died that day in 2002, I would have been remembered as a faithful Jehovah's Witness who remained loyal to organizational doctrine until the end. Instead, I'm alive to be remembered as a man who chose love over fear, life over death, thinking over blind obedience. I'm here to watch my grandchildren grow up, to support my wife through her own journey of discovery, to help other people find their way out of authoritarian religion and into authentic spirituality. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you very much for trusting us. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'll be very happy to tell your story on our channel.